He thought this would be the easiest testimony to dismiss, but he had no idea he was seconds away from losing control of the entire courtroom. The polished wooden walls of courtroom 12 reflected the afternoon light in long, quiet lines. As Judge Thomas Whitaker adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the case file in front of him, everything about his posture signaled confidence, routine, and finality. He had presided over hundreds of cases, and this one felt no different. Across the room, the attorneys stood prepared, their arguments aligned, their narratives clean and structured, while the defendant, Kevin Brooks, sat motionless at the defense table, his hands resting together, his expression distant not from indifference, but from exhaustion, the kind that comes when every word spoken around you feels already decided before you can respond. The prosecutor stepped forward, delivering her final points with practiced clarity, each sentence reinforcing the same timeline, the same sequence, the same conclusion that had guided the case from the beginning. And as she finished, Judge Whitaker nodded once, already shifting his attention toward closure, but then his eyes moved briefly toward the witness stand where a man stood waiting quietly, unnoticed until now. Darius Coleman, a delivery worker still wearing his Navy uniform, slightly wrinkled from a long day, his presence simple, almost out of place in a room defined by authority and precision. The judge tilted his head slightly, a faint smile forming, not of amusement, but of dismissal. "You are the delivery driver, correct?" he asked, his tone light enough to draw a few quiet reactions from the room. Darius nodded once, his hands resting calmly at his sides. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice steady, not loud, not defensive, just present. The judge leaned back, slightly glancing at the attorneys before returning his gaze to the witness. "And you believe your observation is relevant to this case?" he said, the hint of a smile still there, the kind that suggested the answer had already been decided before it was given. A few members of the jury exchanged brief looks, some curious, others indifferent, because to them this was simply another moment, another detail in a process that felt complete. Darius did not react to the tone. He did not shift his posture or attempt to assert himself. He simply stood there, as if waiting for the right moment to speak. "I was making a delivery that night," he said carefully. "Same building, same floor." The prosecutor barely looked up, making a note before continuing to organize her documents, clearly unconcerned, while the defense attorney watched with mild interest, unsure if anything of value would come from it. Judge Whitaker let out a small breath, the kind that carries more meaning than words. "Proceed, if you must," he said, waving his hand slightly, as if granting permission rather than acknowledging importance. And in that small gesture, the room understood exactly how this testimony was being received, not as a turning point, not as a challenge, but as something to move past quickly. The air remained calm, controlled, predictable, but something in Darius's stillness suggested otherwise, his eyes moving briefly across the room, not searching, not hesitating, but measuring, as if he had already seen something no one else had recognized yet. And as he took a small step forward, preparing to continue, the quiet rhythm of the courtroom held steady, unaware that it was about to be interrupted by a detail so simple, so precise, that it would force everyone in that room to stop and listen, whether they intended to or not. The room remained steady for a moment longer, as if nothing of consequence had been said yet, but the stillness around Darius carried a different weight, now subtle but present, the kind that begins before anyone understands why. Judge Whitaker glanced briefly toward the clock mounted high on the wall, then back to the witness stand, his patience thinning, not out of frustration, but out of certainty that this would not change anything. "Be specific," he said, his tone clipped now, less amused, more procedural, as though moving the process along mattered more than what was being said. Darius nodded once, not hurried, not hesitant, his voice calm as he continued. "I arrived at the building at 8:39 p.m. I remember the time because my delivery app logs every stop, and I had 3 more orders after that." He paused just enough for the words to settle, then added, "The door was answered immediately." A faint shift moved through the room, small but noticeable. The defense attorney leaned forward slightly, his pen hovering above his notepad, while the prosecutor finally looked up, her expression tightening just enough to signal attention, but not concern. "And what does that have to do with this case?" she asked quickly, her voice controlled, but sharper now, as if she wanted to contain the direction before it moved further. Darius did not look at her. He kept his eyes forward, focused not on the people, but on the moment itself. "The timeline presented says the incident happened at 8:42 p.m., he said carefully, "but I was standing right there at that time." The words did not echo, they settled. and for the first time the room did not move forward immediately. Judge Whittaker's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the faint smile gone, replaced by a more neutral focus as he leaned slightly forward. "Are you suggesting the timeline is incorrect?" he asked, not dismissively this time, but with measured curiosity. Darius did not answer right away. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded receipt slightly worn from being carried throughout the day, his movements deliberate as he placed it on the witness stand. "This is the delivery confirmation signed at 8:42 p.m., he said quietly, GPS tracked and time-stamped. The clerk stepped forward to take the document, while the prosecutor straightened her posture. "Quickly, that only proves you were there. It does not establish anything about the incident itself," she said, but the confidence in her voice had narrowed just enough to be felt. The defense attorney stood now, his chair scraping softly against the floor. "Your Honor, if the witness was present at the exact time of the alleged incident, then the sequence presented by the prosecution may not be accurate." His tone was careful, not aggressive, but firm enough to shift attention fully toward the witness. Judge Whittaker looked down at the receipt, then back at Darius, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the bench, not tapping, not moving, just still, as if holding the moment in place. "What did you observe?" he asked. The room waited this time, not out of obligation, but out of focus. Darius took a small breath, not to steady himself, but to ensure precision. "The hallway was quiet. The door across from me was open slightly, and I heard a conversation inside, not loud, but clear enough to notice." He paused, then added, "The voice did not match the person described in the report." The silence that followed was different now, no longer routine, no longer predictable. It carried something else, something forming just beneath the surface, as if the case that had seemed complete moments ago was beginning to loosen at its edges, and no one in the room could yet see how far it would unravel. The silence stretched longer this time, not because no one had anything to say, but because no one was certain how to respond. Judge Whittaker remained still, his gaze fixed on Darius, as if trying to measure the weight of what had just been introduced into the room. "Clarify that statement," he said finally, his voice controlled but no longer dismissive, the shift subtle yet unmistakable. Darius nodded, once his posture unchanged, his tone steady. "The report describes a voice raised during the incident, male, mid-tone, consistent with the defendant," he said carefully, "but what I heard was different, lower, slower, and it did not match him." A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom, not loud, not disruptive, but enough to alter the atmosphere, the kind of shift that signals something is no longer aligned. The prosecutor stepped forward. Quickly, her expression composed, but tighter, now her voice firm as she addressed the witness. "You are not trained in voice identification, are you?" she asked, attempting to reframe the moment into something smaller, something dismissible. Darius met her question without hesitation. "No, I am not," he said simply, "but I make over 30 deliveries a day. I hear people speak in all kinds of situations. I remember differences." The answer was not defensive, it was factual, and that made it harder to dismiss. Judge Whittaker leaned back slightly, his fingers now pressing together in thought rather than resting idly. "And you are certain about the time?" he asked again, returning to the detail that had started the shift. Darius glanced briefly toward the clerk, where the receipt now rested, before answering. "Yes, Your Honor, the app records every stop automatically. It does not allow manual changes once confirmed." The clerk nodded quietly in confirmation after reviewing the document, and that small acknowledgement carried more weight than expected. The defense attorney stepped forward, now his voice measured, but gaining strength. "Your Honor, if the witness is correct, then the timeline we have relied on may not be accurate, and if the timeline is not accurate, then the sequence of events must be reconsidered." The words settled slowly, each one opening a possibility that had not existed moments before. Kevin Brooks lifted his head slightly, his eyes fixed on the witness, not with hope yet, but with attention, as if something long buried was beginning to surface. Judge Whittaker looked down at the case file, flipping one page, then another, his movements slower, now more deliberate, as if searching for confirmation within the structure he had already accepted, but nothing on the page addressed what had just been introduced, because this detail had not been part of the original narrative. The prosecutor spoke again, this time more carefully. "Even if the witness was present, it does not prove that the incident did not occur as described. It only suggests a discrepancy in timing," she said, but the certainty in her tone had shifted. It no longer guided the room, it followed it. Darius remained still, allowing the discussion to move without interruption, his role not to argue, but to present, and that quiet restraint made his presence more difficult to ignore than any forceful statement could have. Judge Whitaker closed the file slowly, his eyes lifting once more to the witness. "You said the door was open," he said. "How far?" Darius answered without hesitation. "Just enough to hear, clearly not enough to see everything. But I saw movement, and I remember one thing specifically." He paused, not for effect, but for accuracy, and in that pause the room leaned in, not physically, but in attention, because whatever came next would either anchor this shift or dissolve it completely. The person inside was holding a phone and speaking calmly, not arguing, not raised, not urgent. He said. The courtroom fell still again, and this time the silence felt different, not uncertain, not hesitant, but focused, as if the structure of the case was no longer holding itself together on its own, and every detail now mattered more than the authority that had once defined it. The room did not move forward, it tightened, every detail now under scrutiny, every assumption no longer safe within the structure it had once relied on. Judge Whitaker remained silent for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Darius, not with dismissal, but with calculation, the kind that comes when certainty begins to fracture. "You are stating that the behavior you observed does not align with the reported incident," he said slowly, each word measured. Darius nodded, once his posture steady. "Yes, Your Honor." The tone, the pace, the environment, it did not match what has been described in the report. The prosecutor stepped forward immediately, her composure intact, but her urgency no longer hidden. "Observation is not evidence, Your Honor. The witness cannot confirm what happened inside that room, only what he believes he heard," she said, her voice firm, attempting to draw a clear boundary around the moment, but the line no longer held as firmly as before. The defense attorney moved quickly to respond, his voice controlled, but sharper now. "What the witness is establishing is inconsistency, and inconsistency within a timeline that has been presented as exact is not minor, it is foundational." The words landed differently this time, not as argument, but as disruption. Kevin Brooks leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Darius, not with hope yet, but with recognition that something essential had shifted. Judge Whitaker exhaled slowly, his hand lifting briefly toward his glasses before lowering again, a subtle gesture that marked the transition from authority to evaluation. "Clerk, bring the timeline forward," he said. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life, displaying the sequence of events that had guided the entire case, every timestamp, every movement, every conclusion aligned with precision, at least until now. The judge studied it for a moment longer before speaking again. "Mr. Coleman, if your delivery was confirmed at 8:42 p.m. and your presence lasted approximately 3 minutes, that places you at the scene during the exact window described in the report," he said, his tone neutral but focused. Darius nodded again. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's eyes remained on him. "And during that time you heard no raised voices, no urgency, no indication of conflict?" Darius answered without hesitation. "No, Your Honor." It was calm, steady, like a normal conversation. The room absorbed the statement differently this time, not as a possibility, but as a contradiction. The prosecutor stepped closer to the screen, pointing briefly at the timeline. "The incident could have occurred immediately after the witness left the window, is narrow but still possible," she said, quickly attempting to restore alignment, but her words no longer settled as firmly as before, because the certainty had already been broken. The defense attorney shook his head slightly. "That would require the entire sequence to shift, and there is no evidence supporting that adjustment," he replied. The judge remained still, his gaze moving from the screen to the witness, then back again. The structure of the case, now visible not as a solid foundation, but as something that depended entirely on one precise alignment, and that alignment was no longer holding. The silence returned, not empty, but dense, filled with the realization that something essential had changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that could not be undone. And as the judge leaned back slightly, his voice quieter now, yet carrying more weight than before, "Continue, Mr. Coleman." It was no longer permission, it was necessity, because whatever came next would determine whether this crack in the case would close or widen beyond control. The courtroom held its breath in a way that no one could ignore anymore, not out of suspense, but out of recognition that the direction of the case no longer belonged to the structure that had guided it from the beginning. Darius stood still for a moment longer, his eyes steady, not searching for approval, not reacting to the tension that now filled the room, but focusing only on what he knew to be accurate. "When I stepped back into the hallway after the delivery, I checked my next order," he said, his voice calm, measured, each word placed carefully. That is when I noticed something else. The judge did not interrupt this time. He simply watched his earlier authority replaced by attention that could not afford to miss anything. What did you notice? Judge Whitaker asked, his tone quieter now, but carrying more weight than before. Darius shifted slightly, not out of discomfort, but to recall the moment precisely. The door that was open. Closed slowly, not quickly, not abruptly, just normally, like someone finishing a conversation. The detail was simple, almost insignificant on its own, but in the context of everything that had already been said, it landed differently. The prosecutor frowned slightly, her pen tapping once against her notepad before stopping, as if even that small movement felt too loud in the silence. That does not establish anything about the timing of the incident, she said, attempting to regain control of the narrative, but her voice no longer moved the room the way it had before. The defense attorney stepped forward. Immediately, his focus sharpened. Actually, it does, Your Honor, if the interaction inside that room remained calm until after 8:42, then the reported escalation could not have occurred within the established window. He paused briefly, letting the logic settle before continuing. That would mean the entire sequence of events requires reevaluation. Kevin Brooks lifted his head fully. Now his eyes fixed on Darius, not with uncertainty anymore, but with something closer to understanding, as if the truth that had been distant was now moving into reach. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his fingers resting against the edge of the bench, his posture no longer relaxed, every detail now demanding attention. Mr. Coleman, you are certain about what you heard and observed? He asked. Darius did not hesitate. Yes, Your Honor, I remember it clearly because it did not match the urgency I heard. Described later when the report was read. The room absorbed that sentence differently than anything before. It was no longer just a contradiction, it was a misalignment that could not be easily explained away. The clerk glanced again at the receipt, then at the timeline displayed on the screen, the two no longer fitting together as cleanly as they had moments ago. The prosecutor opened her mouth to respond, but paused for a fraction of a second too long. And in that pause, the room understood something had shifted beyond argument. Judge Whitaker sat back slowly, his gaze moving from the witness to the timeline, then to the attorneys on both sides, as if measuring not just the evidence, but the integrity of what had been presented to him. If this account is accurate, he said finally, his voice steady but altered, then the court has been operating under an incomplete understanding of the sequence. The statement did not raise tension, it confirmed it. And in that confirmation, the foundation of the case loosened further, not collapsing yet, but no longer secure, and as the silence returned once more, it carried a different meaning, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but the quiet realization that one overlooked detail had begun to dismantle everything that had once seemed certain. The courtroom no longer felt like a place moving toward resolution, it had become a space where every assumption was being carefully reconsidered. Judge Whitaker remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the timeline displayed before him. The alignment that once appeared precise, now carrying visible fractures, his fingers pressed lightly together, not in authority, but in thought. We will examine this further, he said finally, his voice steady but noticeably altered, no longer directing the outcome, but responding to it. The prosecutor stepped forward quickly, her posture composed, but her control narrowing with each passing second. Your Honor, the witness has provided an interpretation, not a definitive contradiction. The timeline remains valid unless proven otherwise, she said, but the words did not land with the same certainty as before because the room had already begun to question the foundation beneath them. The defense attorney did not hesitate this time, his voice firm but measured. What the witness has introduced is not interpretation, it is a fixed point in time that does not shift. If that point cannot be reconciled with the current sequence, then the sequence itself must be reconsidered. The statement settled heavily, not as argument, but as logic that could not be easily dismissed. Kevin Brooks remained still, but his posture had changed completely, no longer withdrawn, but present, his attention fixed on the exchange, as if understanding that something essential was unfolding beyond anyone's control. Darius stood quietly, allowing the conversation to move without interruption, his role unchanged, not to persuade but to clarify, and that restraint continued to hold the room in a way no forceful claim could. The clerk adjusted the display, once more zooming in on the timestamp and cross-referencing it with the recorded timeline, each number now examined not as confirmation, But as a potential point of failure, Judge Whittaker leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the sequence. If this timestamp is accurate, then the reported progression of events cannot occur as presented, he said slowly, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition of what was becoming unavoidable. The prosecutor responded immediately, but her voice carried a trace of urgency now. There may be a delay in perception or a gap between observation and the reported event, she suggested, attempting to restore flexibility to the timeline. But the argument no longer held the same strength because the structure it relied on had already been weakened. The defense attorney shook his head slightly. The witness described continuous presence. Within that window, there is no gap to account for, he replied, and this time there was no immediate counter. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different from before. It was no longer uncertain or tentative. It was definitive in its shift, the kind that marks the moment when a narrative stops holding itself together and begins to separate under scrutiny. Judge Whittaker sat back slowly, his gaze moving from the screen to Darius, then to the attorneys, as if weighing not just the evidence but the integrity of the process itself. Mr. Coleman, he said quietly, is there anything else you recall that may clarify this discrepancy? The question was not casual, it carried the weight of the entire proceeding. Because whatever came next would determine whether this was a minor inconsistency or a fundamental flaw. Darius paused for a brief moment, not searching for an answer, but selecting the exact detail that mattered most. Yes, Your Honor, he said calmly. There is one more thing. And as he spoke those words, the room leaned in once again, not out of curiosity, but because everyone understood now that even the smallest detail had the power to change everything. The room did not breathe the same way anymore. It held itself in a kind of suspended awareness, as if every person inside understood that the next words would not simply add to the case, but redefine it entirely. Judge Whittaker leaned forward slightly, his attention now fixed with a precision that had not been there before. Go ahead, Mr. Coleman, he said quietly, no longer guiding the process, but following it. Darius nodded, once his posture unchanged, his voice calm, but carrying more weight than at any point before. When I handed over the package, I asked for a name as confirmation, like I always do, he said. The prosecutor shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing, as if anticipating something she could contain, but she did not interrupt this time. The defense attorney remained still, his focus locked on the witness, knowing that this moment had moved beyond routine questioning. And the name you were given, the judge prompted, his tone measured. Darius answered without hesitation. It was not Kevin Brooks. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, not a ripple, not a murmur, just stillness. The name sat in the air like something tangible, something that could not be reshaped or redirected because it did not rely on interpretation, it relied on memory tied directly to a recorded moment. The clerk instinctively looked down at the receipt again, scanning the signature line more carefully than before, while the prosecutor stepped forward quickly, her voice controlled but edged now. Names can be misheard or misrecorded, especially in routine exchanges. This does not establish identity, she said, but the argument felt thinner even as it was spoken. Darius did not react to her tone. He simply continued, I always repeat the name back to confirm before completing the delivery. That is part of the process, and I remember this one clearly because it was different from what I saw later in the report. The defense attorney moved, then stepping forward with a controlled urgency. Your Honor, if the individual who accepted the delivery identified themselves differently from the defendant and did so within the exact time frame of the alleged incident, then the assumption that Mr. Brooks was present becomes highly questionable. His words did not push they aligned with what was already forming. Judge Whittaker's expression shifted again, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be ignored, his earlier certainty now replaced by something far more deliberate, his gaze moving between the witness, the receipt, and the timeline, as if attempting to reconcile pieces that no longer fit. The prosecutor opened her mouth to respond, but paused for just a moment too long, and in that moment the room understood that the narrative had slipped beyond her control. Kevin Brooks sat completely still, his eyes fixed on Darius, not with hope, but with recognition, as if hearing something that finally matched what he had known all along. The judge leaned back slowly, his fingers resting against the bench, not tapping, not moving, just still, as he processed the implication of a single detail that had shifted the foundation of the entire case. Mr. Coleman, he said quietly, you are certain about the name you were given? Darius met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, Your Honor, The answer did not echo, it settled, and as it did the courtroom seemed to recalibrate around it, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone, because what had once been treated as irrelevant had now become central, and what had once been certain was no longer holding itself together under the weight of something as simple as a name that did not belong. The silence did not break, it deepened, as if the entire courtroom had shifted into a different space where assumptions no longer held, and every word carried consequence. Judge Whitaker remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Darius, as if measuring not just the statement, but the certainty behind it. State the name you were given, he said finally, his voice calm, but unmistakably focused. Darius did not hesitate. Michael Turner, he replied clearly. The name settled into the room, and for a brief second, nothing moved. The prosecutor's posture tightened, her pen pausing mid-motion, as if even the smallest sound might disrupt the fragile balance that had formed. That name does not appear anywhere in the case record, she said quickly, attempting to contain the impact, but her voice carried a strain that had not been there before. The defense attorney stepped forward. Immediately his expression sharpened. Exactly, Your Honor, which means the individual present at that time may not have been the defendant. His words aligned directly with the evidence now unfolding, not pushing the narrative, but following where it led. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward the clerk. Review the evidence log for any mention of that name, he instructed. The clerk moved quickly, scanning through the digital records, each entry examined with heightened attention before finally shaking their head. No record of that name appears in any submitted documentation. The confirmation did not echo, it settled heavier than expected. Kevin Brooks closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in recognition that something had shifted beyond doubt. His hands still resting on the table, but no longer tense. The prosecutor stepped forward again, her voice controlled, but more deliberate now. A name given during a brief interaction is not definitive proof of identity. It could be misdirection or misunderstanding, she argued, but the structure of her reasoning no longer held the same authority because it now existed alongside a contradiction that could not be ignored. Darius remained composed, his gaze steady. I always confirm names before completing a delivery. It is part of the process. I repeated it back, and the person acknowledged it, he said simply. The clarity of his statement left little room for reinterpretation. Judge Whitaker's hand moved slowly across the surface of the bench, not in impatience, but in thought, his earlier certainty now replaced by careful evaluation. If the individual who accepted the delivery identified themselves differently and did so within the exact time frame of the alleged incident, then the court must consider the possibility that the timeline and identification are both incomplete, he said, his voice measured but carrying a weight that had not been present before. The room absorbed the statement, fully, no longer resisting the shift, but recognizing it as unavoidable. The defense attorney nodded once, his focus unwavering. Your Honor, this is no longer a minor discrepancy. This calls into question the foundation of the case itself, he said. The judge did not respond immediately, his gaze moving from the witness to the defendant to the timeline displayed on the screen, every element now part of a structure that was no longer aligned. And as the silence returned once more, it carried a different meaning, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but the quiet realization that the case had reached a point where it could no longer proceed as it had before, because one overlooked detail had not only disrupted the narrative, it had exposed the possibility that the wrong conclusion had been forming all along. The courtroom no longer resembled a place where decisions were made with certainty. It had become a space where every assumption was being carefully dismantled piece by piece. Judge Whitaker remained seated, but his posture had changed completely, his authority no longer projected outward, but drawn inward as he evaluated what now stood before him. Clerk, cross-reference all witness statements with the identified timeline, he said, his voice steady but stripped of its earlier confidence. The command was not routine, it was corrective. The clerk moved quickly, bringing up the compiled testimonies, each statement aligned previously with the timeline, now displayed side by side, revealing subtle inconsistencies that had once been overlooked but now stood out with unmistakable clarity. The prosecutor stepped forward again, her tone controlled but noticeably restrained. Your Honor, these variations do not necessarily invalidate the core sequence. They may reflect differences in perception rather than fact, she said, attempting to preserve what remained of the structure, but her argument no longer guided the room it followed behind it. The defense attorney did not respond immediately. He allowed the evidence to continue unfolding on the screen as timestamps and statements were examined with a precision that had not existed earlier in the trial. Kevin Brooks remained still, but his gaze was no longer distant. It was present, focused, as if every second now carried weight that had been denied to him before. Darius stood quietly at the witness stand, his role unchanged, his presence steady as the source of a shift he had not forced, but simply revealed. Judge Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his eyes moving between the data points displayed before him. "The alignment is inconsistent," he said quietly, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition. "Multiple statements rely on a sequence that does not reconcile with the fixed timestamp provided by the witness." The words did not echo, they settled heavily across the room. The prosecutor hesitated for a brief moment before responding. "That does not eliminate the possibility of the event occurring within a revised time frame," she said, but the statement lacked the certainty it once carried because the foundation supporting it had already been weakened. The defense attorney finally stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "A revised time frame would require new evidence, not reinterpretation of existing statements. And at present there is no such evidence before the court." His words did not challenge, they clarified, and in that clarification the room moved further away from its original direction. Judge Whitaker sat back slowly, his gaze lifting from the screen to the witness, then to the attorneys, as if measuring not just the evidence, but the integrity of the process itself. If the identity presented in the testimony does not match the defendant and the timeline does not support the sequence of events, then the court must consider that the current narrative is incomplete. He said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been present at the beginning of the trial. The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was definitive, the kind that marks a turning point where continuation in the same direction is no longer possible. The clerk paused her movements, waiting for the next instruction, but none came immediately because the next step was no longer procedural. It was fundamental. The judge's hand rested against the bench, unmoving, as he looked once more at the timeline that had guided the entire case, and then at the man who had quietly disrupted it without raising his voice or asserting authority. And in that moment the courtroom understood something that could not be undone. The case had not simply weakened, it had lost the structure required to proceed as it once had, and whatever came next would not restore what had been, it would replace it entirely. The courtroom did not erupt, it settled into something far more controlled and far more serious, the kind of stillness that comes when a decision is no longer about choosing between two sides, but about correcting something that should not have happened in the first place. Judge Whitaker remained seated for a moment longer, his eyes moving slowly across the room as if acknowledging each person not individually, but as part of a system that had just been tested. "This court cannot proceed under the current framework," he said finally, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that felt different from before, not assumed, but earned through recognition. The words did not raise tension, they confirmed it. The prosecutor stood still, her earlier confidence replaced by careful restraint, her position no longer supported by the alignment she had relied on. The defense attorney did not move immediately. He allowed the weight of the statement to settle fully before speaking. "Your Honor, given the discrepancies in both timeline and identification, we request immediate suspension of proceedings pending full review." His tone was measured but firm, not pressing the moment, but aligning with it. Kevin Brooks sat upright, now his posture steady, his gaze forward, no longer carrying the distance that had defined him earlier, because the room had shifted around him, not in sympathy, but in acknowledgement. Judge Whitaker nodded slightly, his hand resting against the bench before lifting just enough to signal transition. "Proceedings are hereby suspended," he said clearly. "All evidence will be subject to immediate re-examination, and any conclusions drawn from the current record are to be considered incomplete." The statement moved through the room, not loudly, but with finality. The clerk began organizing the documents on the screen, the once clean timeline now marked by gaps and inconsistencies that could not be ignored. The prosecutor stepped back, her expression controlled but thoughtful, no longer shaping the narrative, but reconsidering it within a structure that had changed. The defense attorney placed his hands lightly on the table, his attention steady, as if recognizing that the outcome was no longer being decided in that moment, but had already begun to shift. Darius remained at the witness stand, his presence unchanged, not elevated, not acknowledged beyond what was necessary, but central in a way that could not be undone. He had not argued, He had not challenged, he had simply introduced a detail that the system could not ignore, and in doing so he had altered the direction of everything. Judge Whittaker looked at him, once more his gaze no longer dismissive, no longer skeptical, but measured. "You may step down, Mr. Coleman," he said quietly, and the tone carried something new, not praise, not apology, but recognition. Darius nodded once, and stepped away, his movements calm as he returned to the quiet position he had held before. The room slowly began to move again, not with urgency, but with careful intention, each person now aware that what had just occurred was not a disruption but a correction. As Kevin Brooks remained seated for a moment longer before standing, the shift became fully visible, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. The case had not ended, it had been stopped. And in that distinction, everything changed, because what had once been moving toward a conclusion was now returning to the beginning. And as the courtroom doors opened, and the outside world waited, unaware of the exact moment that had caused it, one truth settled clearly within those walls: the smallest detail, when left unexamined, can shape an entire outcome, but when finally seen, it has the power to stop everything instantly. The courtroom did not return to normal after the suspension, it shifted into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried awareness of what had just been uncovered. Judge Whittaker remained at the bench longer than necessary, reviewing the documents again, not because they were unclear, but because they now required a different level of scrutiny, his earlier confidence replaced by a measured responsibility that could not be ignored. The attorneys gathered their materials slowly, no longer moving with the certainty of a case nearing conclusion, but with the caution of one that had just been reopened. Kevin Brooks stood near the defense table, his posture steady, his expression no longer distant, but reflective, as if processing not only what had happened, but what it meant for everything that had led him there. Darius Coleman stepped away from the witness area, quietly, his presence returning to what it had been before, unnoticed by most, yet impossible to disregard by those who had paid attention. The prosecutor paused near her table, reviewing her notes, her focus shifting from presentation to verification, her earlier narrative now something that required re-examination rather than reinforcement. The defense attorney remained composed, his gaze following the documents as they were gathered, not with satisfaction, but with recognition that the case was no longer defined by argument, but by correction. Judge Whittaker finally stood, his robes settling as he stepped down from the bench, his expression firm but thoughtful, his role no longer to conclude, but to ensure that what followed would be based on something more precise than assumption. "All parties are instructed to prepare for a full evidentiary review," he said, his voice controlled, yet carrying a clarity that had not been present before. "No further proceedings will continue until the discrepancies are resolved." The statement was not dramatic, but it carried weight that extended beyond the room, because it marked a transition from decision to accountability. The clerk secured the files carefully, each document now treated not as confirmation, but as something that required validation. The screen that once displayed a clear timeline, now dark, reflecting only the room itself, as if the case had been reset to a point before conclusions were formed. Darius moved toward the exit, his steps steady, his expression unchanged, not seeking acknowledgement, not expecting recognition, because his role had never been to stand at the center, but to introduce something that could not be ignored. Kevin Brooks watched him briefly as he passed, not with gratitude expressed, but with understanding shared, because both had stood in the same moment where truth had shifted direction without force, without demand. Outside the courtroom, the hallway carried a low hum of voices, conversations beginning to form, questions rising as word spread that the trial had been halted, not concluded. And inside that space something remained clear, even as everything else moved into uncertainty. The case had not failed, it had been corrected, and that correction did not come from authority or argument. It came from a single detail that had been overlooked until someone, without status, without influence, and without recognition, chose to speak, and in doing so, revealed that the system, when confronted with truth, does not collapse, it adjusts. And in that adjustment, everything that follows must be built again from the ground up. The courthouse did not return to its usual rhythm in the hours that followed. Instead, it settled into a quieter tension, where every conversation carried a trace of what had been uncovered. Inside courtroom 12, Judge Whittaker sat alone in his chamber, reviewing the case materials once more, not as a routine obligation, but as a necessity. His eyes moving carefully across each document, each statement, each timestamp that had once aligned so cleanly, but now revealed gaps that could no longer be overlooked. He paused at the delivery record again, the simple receipt that had shifted everything, and for a moment, he remained still, recognizing that the most significant disruption had not come from complexity, but from clarity. Meanwhile, in a smaller conference room, the attorneys gathered separately, their discussions no longer about strategy, but about correction. The prosecutor reviewed her files with renewed focus, each piece of evidence now treated with caution rather than confidence, while the defense attorney moved through the timeline again, marking the inconsistencies that had surfaced. Kevin Brooks sat quietly at the end of the table, listening, not interrupting, his presence steady, as if understanding that the process now unfolding would take time, but would finally move in a direction grounded in truth rather than assumption. Across the building, Darius Coleman stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the noise of the city returning in a way that felt distant compared to the silence he had just left behind. He adjusted his jacket slightly and checked his phone, the delivery app already updating his next route, the normal rhythm of his day continuing as if nothing had changed, and in a way it had not for him. He had simply done what he always did, noticed details, remembered them, and spoken when asked, without expectation of recognition, without intention to disrupt. Yet inside the courthouse, his words continued to move through the system, triggering reviews, requests, and quiet reassessments that extended far beyond a single case. Judge Whitaker returned to the bench later that day, not to resume proceedings, but to issue a formal directive, his voice steady as he addressed the empty courtroom now occupied only by clerks and records. All evidence related to this case will undergo independent verification, and all prior assumptions will be re-examined without presumption of accuracy. The statement was recorded, entered into the system, and carried forward not as a conclusion, but as a reset. In that moment, the case no longer belonged to the narrative that had once defined it. It belonged to the process of uncovering what had been missed. And as the courthouse lights dimmed slightly with the passing hours, one understanding remained clear, not spoken, but present in every action that followed. Truth does not require attention to exist. It only requires the moment when it can no longer be ignored. And when that moment arrives, everything built without it must be reconsidered from the beginning. The days that followed did not bring immediate resolution, but they brought something far more significant, a shift in how the case was understood within the system that once moved so confidently toward a conclusion. Judge Whitaker returned to the bench at the scheduled review session, his posture composed, but no longer defined by certainty. Instead, it carried the weight of careful responsibility as the verified records were presented before him, each detail now examined with precision that had been absent before. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been, not because fewer people were present, but because everyone understood that what would be said next would not simply continue the case, it would redefine it entirely. The clerk read through the updated findings, confirming what had already begun to surface, that the original timeline could not be supported without contradiction, and that the identification of Kevin Brooks within that timeline lacked the consistency required for the case to proceed under its previous assumptions. The prosecutor stood still, her earlier confidence replaced by a controlled acceptance of what the evidence now required, while the defense attorney remained focused, his attention steady, not on argument, but on the clarity that had finally emerged. Kevin Brooks sat at the table, no longer weighed down by the same uncertainty that had followed him from the beginning, his posture upright, his gaze forward, as if recognizing that the truth had not arrived suddenly, but had been present all along, waiting for the moment it could be seen without distortion. Judge Whitaker listened without interruption, his eyes moving between the documents and the individuals before him as the final verification was completed. And then, after a brief pause, he spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a finality that did not need to be emphasized. Based on the reviewed evidence and the inconsistencies identified within the original timeline, this court cannot sustain the current charges as presented. The words did not echo, they settled quietly, yet completely. The clerk recorded the statement, while the room remained still, not reacting, not celebrating, but absorbing the meaning of what had just occurred. The case had not ended with a dramatic reversal, it had concluded with a correction, one that restored balance not through force, but through recognition. Kevin Brooks exhaled slowly, not in relief alone, but in understanding that what had been taken from him could not be fully returned, yet what mattered most had been restored, his place within the truth of what had happened. Darius Coleman was not present in the room, That day his role completed long before the outcome was spoken, yet his presence remained in every line of the record, every corrected detail,